Good evening and welcome to our session this evening with Professor John Lennox. I'm delighted to welcome you who are here in the hall, but also those who are with us, friends from different parts of the UK, tuning in online and beyond the UK as well. We hope this evening will be stimulating, challenging, and perhaps in some cases, life-changing. Our evening with Professor John Lennox is jointly hosted by Echoes International and the Glasgow University Christian Union. Echoes International are a mission service group supporting 190 people doing gospel work in 28 countries. We have offices in Glasgow and Bath, and tonight is part of our annual conference weekend in Scotland. Glasgow University Christian Union is similarly committed to sharing the good news of Jesus, primarily in the university context amongst friends and peers. It's a passion for the gospel that brings us together in hosting this event. I'd also like to thank the leaders of the Tron at Kelvingrove for allowing us to host the evening in this lovely venue. Your kindness is very much appreciated. The format of the evening will be as follows: a 50-minute lecture by Professor Lennox on the topic, Are God and Faith Anti-Science and Anti-Reason? The lecture will be followed by a short comfort break, after which there will be a 30-minute question and answer session. This won't be a traditional open mic session of questions, but on the screen behind you will see how you can pose a question for John to answer. After the question and answer, as Paul has already said, there will be teas and coffees served downstairs, and there will also be an opportunity to purchase books that John has written from the Globe bookstand downstairs. John Lennox is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University. He's an internationally renowned speaker on the interface of science, philosophy, and religion. John regularly teaches at many academic institutions, including the Side Business School, Wycliffe Hall, and the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics. He's also a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum and has written a number of books exploring the relationship between science and Christianity. He's well known for having participated in a number of televised debates with some of the world's leading atheist thinkers. So I'd like you to welcome John as I now invite him to come and address us.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the warmth of your welcome. It's very kind of you to come, and I hope you're sitting comfortably, are you? So am I. The topic before us this evening is Are Faith and God Anti-Science and Anti-Reason? For many people, particularly in universities, the going idea is that belief in God is old-fashioned, it's irrational, it's lazy, it inhibits intellectual progress. A Nobel Prize winner, Steven Weinberg, a physicist, said that the world needs to wake up from the nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may be our greatest contribution to civilization. I met that pressure many years ago as an undergraduate at Cambridge. I found myself sitting one evening at dinner with a Nobel Prize winner, the first one I'd ever met. And so I decided to ask questions to find out what his science had meant to him in terms of shaping his worldview. And I could sense that the nearer I got to the God question, the less happy he was with me, until he clearly wanted to stop the conversation. So being a kind Irishman, I allowed him to stop the conversation. But he invited me up to his room afterwards, along with 2 or 3 other professors. And they sat me in a chair and they stood around me. And he said to me, "Lennox, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he said, "Then you need to give up this childish faith in God this evening forever in front of witnesses." Talk about pressure. And I summoned up somehow the courage to say to him, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I already have?" And he came out with some philosophical notions that, fortunately, since I'm an avid C.S. Lewis reader, I knew what they were. And so I said, "If that's all you've got to offer me, I'll stick with what I've got and I'll take the risk." And you know, ladies and gentlemen, that put steel into my soul. It made me resolve that if ever I got the chance to speak to people about science and God, the last thing I would do is browbeat them. And I couldn't help thinking that if I'd been an atheist when I was 19 in Cambridge, and they'd all been Christian professors, and they'd tried to get rid of my atheism, it would have been headline news, not only in the university the next day, but all around the United Kingdom. It is sad to my mind. Obviously, this Nobel Prize winner did not know that of all the Nobel Prize winners for science between 1900 and 2000, over 60% are believers in God. And what I want to do is to try at least to introduce you to the idea that faith in God is neither anti-science nor anti-reason, but faith in atheism is both anti-science and anti-reason. And that may surprise some of you. It's very easy to see that faith in God cannot be anti-science, because there is a popular myth that you have science on the one side and God on the other side. That just cannot be true. Now, in Scotland here, you have, of course, heard of the brilliant Professor Peter Higgs from Edinburgh, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics not long ago. Peter Higgs is an atheist. And there's another Nobel Prize winner that I want to introduce to you. I wonder if any of you have ever heard of him. He's our only Irish Nobel Prize winner for science. And he's called E.T.S. Walton. He helped split the atom, actually, with Rutherford. So he's moderately famous. He was a Christian. Now just think of those two men. One an atheist, one a Christian. They both won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Their science doesn't divide them at all. So it's obvious it's possible to believe in God, and that faith in God is not anti-science and anti-reason, if you can, as a believer in God, win the Nobel Prize for Physics. There is, of course, a conflict, and it is not between science and God at all, although it appears to be superficially. It is between two worldviews. You see, what separates between Higgs and Walton, not their science, it is their worldview. Higgs is a naturalist in his philosophy. That is, he believes that nature is all that exists. And Walton is a theist, a Christian theist. And those two worldviews are opposed to each other. And the point to realize at the beginning of our session is there are scientists on both sides. And each side claims science to support it. Richard Dawkins thinks that science leads naturally to naturalism. I think science leads equally naturally to theism. And that's the question we really have to decide. Now, this idea of a conflict between science and God is fueled by the ideology of scientism, which permeates the academy in the Western world today. Alex Rosenberg, whom I debated in Princeton, a philosopher, says that scientism is simply treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both to our own nature and everything else. But that is a very superficially illogical statement, because if you regard science as the only guide to reality, that statement is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. It's probably too late in the evening for logic like that, so I'll pass it by and take you to Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize also and pointed out the limitations of science. The existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? And great scientists are aware that one of the successes of science is precisely because it has limited the scope of the questions it asks. But in spite of the warnings of Medawar and others, we now have the very influential and brilliant physicist Stephen Hawking in his book, The Grand Design. And he looks at some of these questions that Medawar mentions and says, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And you'll notice that that last part of the sentence is scientism. Science is the way to truth. Now, when I first read this in a preview of the book, I was quite puzzled and considerably amused, because this statement that philosophy is dead comes at the beginning of a book on what? The philosophy of science. And I'm afraid, although it will sound like a sharp comment, Hawking amply proves that philosophy is dead as far as he is concerned in the logic he exhibits in the book, as we shall see. I love the warning of one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, Richard Feynman. I believe that a scientist looking at problems out of their field is just as dumb as the next guy. And if we're going to make progress in understanding what's going on, there are a couple of simple principles that we need. First of all, that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. At the beginning of his television series, Cosmos, Carl Sagan said, "The universe is all that is, was, or ever shall be." Now, he's a scientist. He was a brilliant scientist. But that isn't a statement of science. It's simply a statement of his personal belief. And the problem in our culture is that we, rightly in part, give great credence to scientists with real authority, but we forget that that authority doesn't extend to what they have to say when they go outside their field. Stephen Hawking, for instance, when asked about religion, he came up with this one line: "Religion is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark." And I'm afraid I came up with a one line when they asked me what I thought. And I said that atheism was a fairy story for those afraid of the light. Well, you can laugh, and that's very kind, but if you're thinking with me, you'll see those are simply statements of personal belief. They go back to Freud, who thought that religion was an illusion, and from which Richard Dawkins got many of his ideas for his book, The God Delusion. And you see, here is a classic example of going outside your field of expertise. The God delusion. Delusion, as Dawkins admits, is a psychiatric word. It means holding a belief against strong contrary evidence. Now, that's okay for him to go outside his field. I'm going outside my field of pure mathematics tonight. And I'm sure you're glad of that, actually. It's fine to go outside your field, but if you go outside your field, the thing to do is to check what the experts in that field have to say. Dawkins' view is that God is a delusion. Is that what psychiatrists say? So, not being a psychiatrist myself, and aware that Dawkins wasn't, I decided to do some research. And I came across Professor Andrew Sims, who was the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the United Kingdom. Does he agree with Dawkins? Absolutely not. He says the positive benefit of belief in God is one of the best kept secrets of modern psychiatry. And if the results of a vast number of meta-studies had gone in the other direction, and it was shown that belief in God damages your mental health, it would have been front-page news on every newspaper in the world. But because it goes the other way, nobody knows about it. Dawkins is totally unaware of it. And that concerns me, you see, because this is an attempt to use the science of psychology and psychiatry to get across to the public the idea that God is a delusion. But what Dawkins forgets is that the Freudian argument that he's using to do this is a beautifully balanced two-edged sword. Because, you see, as the eminent psychiatrist Manfred Lutz in Germany pointed out in a bestseller, very amusingly, actually, I can't reproduce his wit. He said, of course, if there is no God, Freud gives you a brilliant explanation why religion is a delusion, a wish fulfillment of the desire to have a father figure in the sky to comfort you, if there is no God. Of course, he goes on to say, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you how atheism is a delusion. The desire never to have to encounter God to give an account of the mess you've made of your life and other people's lives. And then he draws his bottom line. He says, as to whether there's a God or not, which is the substantive question, Freud cannot help you at all. So the whole argument of the God delusion disappears when you reverse it. And as that's a case of someone going outside their expertise, it's not particularly impressive. Now, what I want to do is to say something which is very well put by the philosopher Alvin Plantinga. The alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. There is real concord. The alleged concord between science and atheism is superficial. There is real conflict. So let's have a look at some sources of evidence. See, ladies and gentlemen, I am a Christian believer. That means I have faith. But what does faith mean? Faith means a response to evidence. It's evidence-based. It's the kind of thing that you hope your bank manager is going to have in you when you go to ask him for a £500,000 loan. He wants evidence to trust you. And we're all aware of what evidence-based faith means. And so we ask for sources of evidence. Of course, this isn't proof in the mathematical sense. I am a mathematician, and proof in the rigorous mathematical sense only occurs in mathematics. But evidence beyond reasonable doubt we get in many areas of life. And that doesn't mean it's weak. I trusted an aircraft with my life to bring me to Glasgow yesterday. I couldn't prove mathematically it would get me here, but I had to trust it. So we're all used in life to making value judgments and trusting things and people, sometimes with our lives, like aircraft and surgery and so on. And so it is here. It is no different. Because you see, faith in God is not anti-reason. It is based on reason. And I want to give you some of the reasons, just a few of them, from 3 different areas: the history of science, the nature and philosophy of science, and the results of science. C.S. Lewis, commenting on the rise of science and really citing the work of Alfred North Whitehead, said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. And lo and behold, when we look at the relationship between Christianity and the rise of modern science, we get statements like this by the eminent historian Edwin Judge of Australia. Christianity, or above all the biblical doctrine of creation, is itself the creator of the methodology of modern science. We don't hold the Greeks' perspective anymore. In spite of the fact that people keep looking back to it as the origin of science, it is not the origin of science. The book of creation is the origin of modern science, the book of Genesis. And we can go through some of the famous names. Galileo. We could mention Kepler, whose statement I love as a mathematician: the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. I couldn't have put it better myself. Or Isaac Newton. Don't doubt the Creator, because it is inconceivable that accidents alone could be the controller of this universe. Modern science is connected with Christianity. That has fascinated me for years, because far from faith in God hindering reason and science, it was faith in God that was the motor that drove the rise of science and motivated these brilliant people to study nature as a work of the Creator. It goes in exactly the opposite direction which we're led to think. But we can get right to the heart of the contemporary debate by jumping from Newton to another former holder of the Lucasian chair at Cambridge. Newton was the second holder, and Hawking held it too. The famous Times announcement: Hawking, God did not create the universe. And that focuses the problem, because you've got Isaac Newton, who discovered the law of gravitation. He believed in God. And you've got Stephen Hawking, who occupied Newton's chair at Cambridge. He uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. And his argument is very succinct, and it is the key argument, let me say, the central argument of the entire book, The Grand Design. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So here's our question. How do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? And I want to argue that there are 3 main reasons. The first is the use of false logic. The second is the employment of false ideas about the nature of God. And the third is false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. So let's look at the false logic. Here's the statement: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And when I read that first, I thought, come again. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number 1. But then I noticed, because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists. But what would a law of gravity mean if there was no gravity for it to describe? And that opens a window on a confusion that I find all over the place, not only among students, but among professors. And that is the idea that laws are creative. But we know that laws don't even cause anything. Newton's laws of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe, did they? People with cues move billiard balls. The laws describe the motion once it's going. They do not cause the motion. I remember having a little spat, I suppose it was, after a debate with Peter Atkins, the physical chemist at Oxford. And I said to him, just to see how he would react, I said, Peter, tell me, what do you think created the universe? He said, mathematics. Well, I didn't expect that, and I very rudely started to laugh. He said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, I'm sorry, Peter, but that's the silliest thing I've heard for a long time. He said, why is it silly? Well, I said, let me put it simply for you. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? Lewis pointed this out in the 1940s. Doing arithmetic doesn't put money in your pocket. By the way, that is one of the causes of the financial crash. There were some people that thought by doing very clever arithmetic, they could create money, and they found they couldn't. Wittgenstein, the famous philosopher, he got it exactly right when he says the great delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They are not. They are simply descriptions. We need to get it straight. It is a real mystery from the scientific perspective where the laws come from. But laws are meaningless if they've nothing concrete to describe. So there's the second problem. But there's another problem with this sentence. It's a wonderful sentence. If you could invent another one like it, I'd love to hear of it, because it's got 3 distinct levels of self-contradiction in it. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. If I say X creates Y, that's if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, well, if you've got X, you'll get X. What does that mean? Well, as far as I can see, it means that nonsense remains nonsense if scientists write it. You see, this is absurdity. And it's great fun then reading all the books on the topic of nothing. In fact, I've been known to give them lectures on nothing. Now, you may be under the impression that I'm talking about nothing. I hope you're not. But I'm just for a few seconds going to talk about nothing. I never thought I'd live to the day when explanations of the universe fall into 2. On the one side, God, on the other side, nothing. That's where we've got. It's utterly fascinating. Now, how do people get something from nothing? Nothing comes from nothing, and nothing ever could was a song I remember, but none of you will, you're far too young. How do you get something from nothing? Well, the way you do it these days is by redefining nothing. I had a discussion with the world's leading cosmologist at the Harvard-MIT faculty club, pretty daunting place. And Alan Guth, who is a delightful person, the father of the theory of inflation, a brilliant cosmologist, and I couldn't help asking the first question, which is very unusual for me after a discussion, but I said, look, Alan, you're the expert. Tell me, when you astrophysicists use the term nothing, you don't mean nothing in the ordinary, usual sense of the word, absence of anything. He said, no, we don't. I said, thank you very much. But look at this offering. In Lawrence Krauss, who's an astrophysicist from Arizona State University, and I've debated him a couple of unsatisfactory times on the radio. How about this? If your 13-year-old wrote this, what would you say to them? Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? This is nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what disturbs me about it. This is the extent to which Krauss is going to get rid of the idea of a creator who stands behind the universe. You see, Hawking claims, and so does Krauss, and so do others, to get a universe from nothing, but when you investigate their books, they don't deliver. What they end up talking is sheer nonsense, but because that they are famous scientists, people think this is wonderful science. It's not. School kids can analyze, as I've proved again and again, the logic in this kind of thing. So false logic, first of all, then false ideas about God. You see, when I was young, and that's a very long time ago, people understood when I used the word God, I was speaking of the eternal God of the Bible, the creator and sustainer of the universe. But nowadays, people tend to think that God is simply a holding term, an X, to explain what science hasn't yet explained, like the god of lightning. The Greeks didn't understand lightning, so they postulated a god. Do atmospheric physics at Glasgow University down the road, and that god disappears. And so you have a god of the gaps. And therefore they think that I believe that my God will simply disappear when science advances that far. He is a god of the gaps. Now, one of the things that I've noticed, particularly with Hawking, but not only with him, is saying to students and others, you've got to choose between science and God, just like that Nobel Prize winner tried to tell me many years ago. And I couldn't understand this. Why tell me to choose between science and God when there's so many Nobel Prize winners believing in God, until I realized the God they were talking about was not the God I believed in. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen, the logic of it. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then of course you have to choose between science and God, because that is the way you have defined God. Now that is very important. When you talk about God in this whole discourse today, you've got to be absolutely sure you're not talking about the God of the gaps, but the God of the Bible, who's God of the whole show. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. And I just point out to people the elementary fact. The Bible does not begin with the words, in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. It doesn't. You can check it, if you don't believe me. It doesn't. And that's why Newton didn't fall into this mistake when he discovered the law of gravity. He didn't say, I've got a law, I don't need God. No. He said, what a marvelous God who did it that way. His admiration for God increased with his knowledge of nature. So now let me come to false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. What do we mean by explanation? What does the law of gravity explain? Well, I wasn't initially taught very well at school. I was told the law of gravity explained gravity. It was years before I learned that the law of gravity does not explain gravity. Nobody, even today, knows what gravity is. The law of gravity gives you a wonderful mathematical way of working out to a very fine degree of precision the forces between large bodies in motion, but it doesn't tell you what gravity is. So, as an explanation, the law is only partial, and that brings me back to the quotation of Wittgenstein I mentioned before. We can perhaps see this limitation in a much more simple example. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat is being conducted through the base of the kettle. It's agitating the molecules of water. Yes. Why is it boiling? Well, actually, it's boiling because I would like a cup of tea. Now, there are two explanations. Think about them. Do they compete? No. Do they conflict? No. They complement. They are different kinds of explanation. One is in terms of law and mechanism, the other in terms of personal agency. And you will notice they're both necessary. And interestingly enough, people have been drinking tea for centuries, if not thousands of years, before they knew anything about theories of heat. And they've been enjoying the tea as well. The personal explanation is usually the more important one. Now, that's a very simple explanation, illustration, but here's its implication. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. Different kinds of explanation. And I really believe if people could grasp this, it would take so much of the heat of God or science. It would take it right out of that. Because the God explanation is not competing with the scientific explanation. It would be as foolish to suggest that as to say the Henry Ford explanation is competing with the automobile engineering explanation. And Richard Swinburne made the point, I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. The very success of science in showing us how deeply orderly the natural world is provides strong grounds for believing that there is an even deeper cause for that order. Now, I want to come back to that on a moment, but as a stepping stone, I want to point out that explanation does not always go from the simple to the complex. And here's another of the arguments in the God delusion that Richard Dawkins thinks deals finally with the problem of God. He says, look, if you use God as an explanation for anything, well, that's absurd because God is by definition more complex than the thing you are explaining. Well, that sounds wonderful until you apply it to his own book, which I did. I pick up a book, it's called The God Delusion. It's quite complex, it's about 400 pages long, I think. And I ask for its origin. And somebody comes along and says, well, actually, this book originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. And I say, well, that can't be true, of course, obviously, because Dawkins himself says an explanation mustn't be more complex than the thing you're explaining. You see, it doesn't work for his book. It doesn't work for anything that involves language. You're seeing a few words on the screen in front of you. You know that there's a mind behind them, in spite of all the processes, electronic and otherwise, that are involved in generating them. The moment you see language, you postulate a mind behind it. And that leads to a lot of fun that I have with my colleagues who take a very strong reductionist view. You may have heard this story before, but it won't harm hearing it again because it helps us understand the whole thing. And there are several instances, but the one that I remember best was a brilliant biochemist who was not pleased at sitting beside me at dinner because he discovered I was a pure mathematician and told me straight he thought that was dreadfully boring. Yeah. So I backtracked and said, well, I tried to make up for that by being interested in the big questions of life. He said, like what? I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Oh, dear, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm a reductionist, I'm an atheist, we've nothing to talk about, we're going to have a miserable evening. That was an interesting challenge. I said, no. I said, I'm fascinated by reductionism. He said, are you? I said, I know at least 3 kinds. Which kind do you? So he thought for a bit. Well, he said, I split a big problem into little problems. And I said, I do that too. I call that methodological reductionism. So we got that in common. We can talk about reductionism. But he said, I don't mean that. I said, I know you don't mean that. But at least we got something in common. I said, you're an ontological reductionist. Ontos, being. You reduce everything to physics and chemistry. He said, absolutely. Everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. So I said, let's do an experiment. He said, what, at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. So he said, what's the experiment? So I picked up the menu and he looked at it and said, roast chicken, he read. What's the problem? I said, none from where I sit. But I said, you understand it? Yes, he said, it's roast chicken. I said, how do you know? Well, those letters mean roast chicken. How do you know? Well, I've learned English. Okay, I said, you're a reductionist. Yes. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry? Yes. Okay, I said, You tell me where the meaning roast chicken comes from and explain it in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife was there. She was a delightful soul. Because she said rather too loudly, "Get out of that if you can." He didn't try. And he wouldn't mind me telling you. He said, "You know, John," he was getting friendly now, This is amazing. We were having an interesting time. He said, "For 40 years I've gone into my laboratory here in Oxford thinking that could be done." Wow, that was a stunning admission. I was staggered. I said, "But just a minute, physics and chemistry have only been going 400 or 500. He said, "It doesn't matter. You cannot do it without a mind." And then he looked at me. He said, "Where did you get that argument?" I said, "It's okay. I got it from a Nobel Prize winner." Oh, he said, "That's a relief." But then, you see, I discovered he studied DNA. And I said, "Oh, that's the longest word that we've ever found. 3.5 billion letters in the right order in a chemical alphabet." Said, "What about its origin?" Oh, he said, "Chance and necessity." I said, "What? Chance and the laws of nature?" I said, "But you saw ROAST and you immediately postulated mind. What's going on?" Interesting, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it? Every one of the 10 trillion cells in your body contains the longest word we've ever discovered. And we only see a short word. And we postulate a mind, and I'm reminded of Antony Flew, the famous atheist, Richard Dawkins' predecessor. In old age, he discovered this word, and he wrote, research into DNA had shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved. I have been persuaded that it is simply out of the question that the first living matter evolved out of dead matter and then developed into an extraordinarily complicated creature. And that makes life very interesting, doesn't it? Because you see, you've got these two worldviews. One is naturalism, starting with nothing, or the universe, or empty space, or something like that, and producing everything, including conscious minds. Or you have the alternative worldview, which is the exact opposite in terms of its streaming. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. Which makes more sense? Well, to me as a scientist, it's a hands-down win for the biblical view. But finally, I just want to pick up an idea that I mentioned briefly of Swinburne's. Christians have faith. We trust God through Christ, and we believe there's evidence for it. But one of the troubles in the debate is that many people think that science doesn't involve faith. That is a very dangerous falsehood. Let's think about thinking. Now, there were certainly some brilliant thinkers in the world, Einstein, and he was bright enough to see that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. We can understand it to a certain extent. And he talks about the faith, which I've outlined in this quotation. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. Einstein had faith. He expected every scientist to have faith, and every scientist does have faith. In what? Not in God necessarily, but all of us who are involved in science, or indeed any academic discipline whatsoever, all of us start by believing that it can be done. Otherwise, we'd never do it. Now, why do people believe that science can be done? Let's skip over that and just point out that physics can't explain it. This is John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum mechanics at Cambridge. Physics is powerless to explain its fundamental belief in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe. Here's a fascinating thing to me. It has interested me since boyhood. How is it we can do science with our minds? And in more recent days, because this argument has moved into the mainstream, I have gone about it often by asking people I meet, scientists, what do you do science with? And often they're about to say with my mind, when they remember that it's not politically correct to say mind, so they say brain. And I say, well, I actually believe that the brain and the mind are distinct, their stories are distinct, but let's leave it. You do science with your brain. Well, that's very interesting to me. Tell me the story of the brain as you see it. And usually they'll come out with something like this. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided natural process. So I look at them, and I smile, and I say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, if you knew or believed that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it or trust it? I've never had the answer yes to that. Not once. And yet this is what they believe about what they're using to do science with. And they look very puzzled. And they sometimes ask me where I get that argument. And I say, you'll be very surprised. Here's where I get it. Charles Darwin. With me, the horrid doubt, he wrote, always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And this has been built upon. Let's look at Alvin Plantinga again. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism. Now, Plantinga, as many of you know, is an eminent Christian philosopher. But let's go to the atheist, because here's the man that did the most stirring in the last few years in his book entitled Mind and Cosmos, with an explosive subtitle. Remember, he's a hard atheist, by which I mean, he writes, I don't want there to be a God. Now here's what he says. If the mental is not itself merely physical, remember shades of the printing on the paper. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. And Dennis Noble, whose seminar I attend from time to time, suppose we really succeeded in reducing rational behavior to molecular and cellular causation. In that case, we would no longer be able meaningfully to express the truth of what we'd succeeded in doing. In any event, the question does not arise. No such reduction is conceivable. And many other statements about reductionism, but I think Lewis's is the best to sum it up. Lewis was so perceptive about these things. Unless human reasoning is valid, he wrote, no science can be true. If ultimate reality is not material, not to take this into account in our context is to neglect the most important fact of all. Yet, the supernatural dimension has not only been forgotten, it has been ruled out of court by many. The naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and therefore something other than nature exists. My colleague Keith Ward at Oxford writes, if biblical theism is true, not only is matter not the only reality, Matter is not even the prime reality. There is at least one mind that is prior to all matter, that is not in time and therefore is not capable of being brought into being by anything. It is the one truly self-existent reality and the cause of all physical things. I come back to my question. Is faith in God anti-science and anti-reason? No. But faith in atheism would seem to be both anti-science and anti-reason. And what comes through it all for me is the fact that the best explanation I know that gives us deep insight into understanding the universe is, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. We have evidence of it in the mathematical laws that describe the universe, in the rational languages and the computer language we use, in the language of DNA, from every direction, word, word, word. But those are only the foothills, ladies and gentlemen. Because you see, if this is true, then we need to look up towards the mountains, because there's a vastly bigger thing awaiting us. And that is the claim that the Word became human and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. But that's a story for later. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much for stimulating our thinking and for challenging us to challenge. I particularly appreciated the illustration where you helped us understand the difference in the nature of explanation. And thank you for delivering your lecture not only in a stimulating way, but with warmth and with humour as well. And I'm sure that will continue as we have some questions and answers later. But for a few minutes, we're just going to have a break, maybe 5 minutes just to stand up, walk around. John will collate the questions that have come in for John, and then he'll lead another 30 minutes in question and answer. Thank you very much.